I am joined today by my brother-in-law, Mitja, who, in addition to being an extremely pleasant guy, is also blessed with a gentle temperament, a natural tendency to hard work, is intelligent beyond the norm, and also likes to talk about topics that I love to talk about. Mitja has studied archaeology to a very high degree and is familiar with a number of different historical time frames, some of which we will refer to in our talk here today. Mitja is married with children and is also, along with his family, an adventurous type. At the height of Brexit uncertainty, when I was settling myself comfortably into life in Berlin, he and his family were moving from Bonn to the UK to establish a new life on Old Blighty, and my word, have they blossomed. We jump around today from interesting topic to interesting topic, which is nothing new for a talk with me. So I hope you are both patient and also entertained by our meanderings. Mitja, thank you very much for joining me. It's been really tough getting to organize our first podcast together, hasn't it?
Yeah, indeed. I'm a busy man. You're probably a busy man as well. So
Yeah, I'll just agree with you there, and then everybody thinks we're both two extremely busy men. But I mean, okay, first of all, you're my brother-in-law. I think it's important to point out. So if there's any sort of favoritism towards you from the other people on the show have been, at least they'll understand why.
Well, to be fair, I'm everybody's favorite, so it doesn't really count.
Yeah, I'm going to have a word with my mother-in-law in that case. Yeah, but I mean, what's also interesting is that I love talking about sort of social decisions and movement and cultural experiences. And what's, I think it's great for us is that you've done the opposite of what I've done. So, I come from the UK and I'm now living in Germany, and you are from Germany and are now living in the UK. So
yeah,
it's the opposite journey, as it were. And just to give a bit more sort of personal background, when I heard that you were going to be moving to the UK, I thought to myself, the guy is mad, because the timing was strange, wasn't it?
You think with all Brexit looming and the
Yeah.
whole situation pretty much going downhill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of situation, yeah.
Hmm.
But I mean, you guys are really happy out there, aren't you?
Yeah, that's pretty much sums it up. And I always come to think about what a friend of mine said. I mean, it's definitely not something you should build your life around. But what he said in German is einfach mal was Verrücktes machen. So just do something crazy at some point. And yeah, I think partially that move was bold and a bit crazy with all the general situation politically and socio-economically. But I think it has worked out really well for us.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to highlight it because I thought it was going to be very difficult, and I'm sure you still had your challenges. But yeah, you completely proved me wrong. And I really like it when I'm proven to be wrong, because it gives me an opportunity to reflect on why I made the error of judgment. But yeah, I mean, but you're also in a really interesting place, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. So we are currently living in Glastonbury, which is in Somerset, and it's both when it comes to contemporary culture and also history. It's quite an interesting place because it's, you could say, since Roman times, or probably pre-Roman times, it has been quite the melting pot of ideas and spiritual approaches. So yeah,
Mm. I mean, this tallies in pretty much with some of the topics that we're going to talk about a bit later. Obviously, you've
Mm,
got a substantial sort of background in history.
yeah.
So, I mean, I guess if somebody was going to ask you where would you live in the UK, I imagine Glastonbury would already have been quite high up on your list, right?
Yeah. Although if you speak to people about Glastonbury, everybody, so I would say 8 out of 10 people say, "Oh yeah, the festival," whereas local people that live around here will tell you that Glastonbury Festival actually isn't in Glastonbury because it's in Pilton, which
Mm,
is around a 50-minute drive from Glastonbury. So the only
mm,
thing that relates the Glastonbury Festival nowadays to Glastonbury is that from the main stage you can see the tour in the background, and
uh-huh,
that's pretty much it.
okay.
Yeah, but circling back to the idea of moving to the UK at that uh, point in time. So that was 2018 when we decided to make that move, and that was pretty much when um, it was decided that Brexit is going to happen at some point in the future. So that was clear. And then my mum urged us to wait out how the whole situation would play out and how everything would settle with the arrangements between the EU and the UK. But then again, and the way it then played out in the end kind of proved me right. That was the exact correct move to move at that point in time, because as you may recall, the yeah till that the whole arrangements of Brexit were actually sorted out between the EU and UK. That took around 2.5 years. So
Mm.
So if we had waited to make our move once everything was clear how things are going to play out, we would have basically lost 2 years.
Well, maybe even more,
Yeah,
because right now I think the paperwork involved, simply moving goods across the border, is
yeah,
quite complex. So therefore, moving an entire family, I could only imagine, will have been, far more complicated. So I mean, you definitely moved at the right time, considering everything that's happened, and it seems the kids have really settled in quite well as well, haven't they?
yeah. So as far as bureaucracy is concerned, it was actually quite easy because at the time the EU settlement scheme was still open, so there was freedom of movement, and if you wanted to settle in the UK, you could simply apply for settled status, which gives you after a certain amount of time indefinite leave to remain. So so it was filing a bit of paperwork, but um, I mean, currently, I don't know what the current situation is, but I think you have to apply for a visa and also have to have an employment already secured, etc., etc. So it's way more challenging to actually move to the UK as a non-UK citizen.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and as you said, the kids have settled in really, really well. So at the time we moved over, they were, what were they, 6 and 3, and they didn't have a word of English when we came here. But we were really, really lucky with the school they came in, because they were very, very supportive, and they so went to nursery, and went to, I think she went straight into year 2, and they had one teacher allocated to her for the first couple of weeks.
All right. So yeah, you were basically saying about how cool it was for the kids at the school that they joined. Yeah, going from not knowing any English to also being is it given merits? I mean, do they call it that kind of thing? For the good work. I know that your kids have been commended considerably at school, haven't they?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's just a general culture in the UK, but that was my impression pretty much, that people in England love prizes. So,
we get them so rarely
yeah,
internationally.
yeah, maybe it's that, but yeah, the kids brought home a lot of awards for all kinds of achievements at school. And prior to the whole COVID situation, they had also had their assemblies each week in school, in the assembly hall, where they would then be called to the front and get their prize and get a round of applause. And I think that really bolstered their confidence as well.
Yeah,
So,
wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful. Yeah, just quickly then, we touched on Brexit and that
Mm.
it hasn't been a negative thing for at least your move there into the UK. What about the pandemic? Because again, we've got a system which is completely different to the German system, and yet there's no, as in, I can't. Looking and being aware of how the governments over the years have kind of dealt with the pandemic, I can't turn
Yeah.
around and say one has been better than the other. I mean,
Yeah.
there isn't really, is there, a clear way out of it?
No, I think what I really found helpful in the pandemic is having a central government that has a national health service working for them, whereas in Germany you have all the states, the 16 states, who basically all do their own thing, and then the federal government tries to kind of negotiate an approach, but basically everybody does their own thing. Whereas here in the UK, although the quality of the central government is debatable, at least you have kind of a direct approach.
Mm. Yeah, it is an interesting observation to make, the sort of centralized government or the federal decentralized governments in many ways. Of course, there are devolved assemblies. So you've got Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
Yeah,
but
that's right. And they pretty much did their own thing in some ways. So, for example, at the moment, I think the rules in Scotland and Wales are way stricter than in England. I think Boris just doesn't want to be caught in another Christmas party these days.
Yeah, I mean, he's done so many U-turns. He's quite dizzy, I think, by now. But yeah, he's anyway. Okay, because if we descend into sort of Boris critique, we're never going to jump out of that particular hole. But anyway, it's unfortunate. And I would have expected more, really, from an island nation which has in the past used its sort of natural protections and defenses quite well. But unfortunately, when you're fighting an opponent you cannot see, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, there are always even more ways to escalate the approach against that pandemic. For example, if you as I said, you have the federal government in Germany, then you have a more centralized approach in the UK. Although you're quite right, you have Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. But then again, if you see how, for example, China handles the pandemic, it's quite a different approach, where they're saying, okay, we're doing lockdown, but not like, okay, we're doing lockdown, but you're still allowed to go out to do stuff, which isn't really lockdown. But they say, okay, nobody's allowed out, everybody takes a test, and then we kind of know who's got it and who doesn't. And then if there are 2 or 3 cases in a region, then they would do another complete lockdown. But of course, that only works if you're really what's it called?
Authoritarian regime.
Thank you.
That's all right. That's what I'm here for. Yeah. This is also something we can reflect on perhaps a bit later on. Maybe when also in another episode, if we can kind of talk about the historical development of sort of political structures and so on, because I'm sure there is something which you can look at throughout different points of a country's history and say, okay, this influenced that particular move and that particular move, and this is why we kind of have this now. And so sometimes it's not always just a one-off decision to have a specific system, but it develops sort of incrementally, which is the case of the UK. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So obviously we've kind of hinted heavily that there is a historical element to our discussion today, but again, also to focus on Glastonbury and also to sort of have a more personal element to it. It's not just because of the historical element that was the reason for choosing Glastonbury, but if I'm not mistaken, your wife also has cultural and other interests which link you to the region.
Yeah, that's right. So to be precise, her linkage to Glastonbury is the main reason we chose that as our destination to settle over to the UK. As we mentioned previously, so across the times, Glastonbury has been a focal point for spirituality. So as the myth goes, or I don't know if it's actually based in historical fact, but the first church in England was founded in Glastonbury, and there's that myth about Joseph of what's his name, Joseph of Arimathea.
Okay.
Is it one of the followers of Jesus is said to be after the crucifixion, having traveled to the UK and kind of making landfall in Glastonbury, because in Roman times there was still direct access to the sea from Glastonbury. And so it's the legend says he came to England in Glastonbury, and on the Weary Hill where they all landed, he kind of put down his walking staff, with which was made of hawthorn, and then it is said to have taken root there, and the tree having grown out of it, which is the holy thorn. And I don't know if you know, but there's the tradition that for each Christmas, a twig of the holy thorn gets sent to the Queen by I think it's the eldest pupil of St. John's School, which is the school our kids went to. So the oldest pupil cuts a twig of the holy thorn, and that gets sent to the Queen for her Christmas table.
Wonderful. Okay. Does she use it to stir her tea, or is that far too dramatic a suggestion?
I don't know what she does with it. I think it's just part of the centerpiece of the table or something like that.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. When you mention it, actually, I remember looking at a documentary about Stonehenge, which I believe is not too far from where you are.
It's a half an hour drive, approximately.
And the river that sort of flows past, which is now more of a stream than a river, but apparently in certain thousands of years ago, it was actually quite a torrent, if not a fully blown river. So I can completely understand that there would have been greater access to the area in the past.
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at the geological profile here of the Somerset levels, you're pretty much 1 or 2 meters above sea level in the Downs. So it's still a very moist kind of region. So if you then take into account that the sea levels during Roman times were way higher, then with 1 or 2 meters, you're pretty much back in the sea. So depending how climate change will play out, we could end there in the next 100, 150 years again.
Or maybe even sooner. So hopefully you've got your boating skills sorted out.
I don't think it will approach that quickly, so we'll probably can move a bit quicker.
Okay, fair enough. But also, I have another student, and his wife also visits Glastonbury for the meetings or conferences. It's having lived in the UK and having grown up completely unaware of all of this, was outside of the sort of historical myths connecting, Merlin and Arthur and those kinds of legends, which apparently were first noted down by a French author about 500 years after Arthur is supposed to have lived. But anyway, that's a different topic. But I mean, the historical facts suggest that at a certain point in the 8th or 9th centuries, or maybe even earlier, there was a popular person called Arthur, because lots of young boys were named Arthur. So there is some character from the past who clearly influenced some of the sort of political and social mechanisms within England. How powerful do you think is it fair to call it Druidism, or is there a different term which is better for it?
Well, if you're looking at the different people that come to Glastonbury these days, there's really a multitude of beliefs and approaches to spirituality here. So you have Christians of all sorts, you have Buddhists, you have pagans or heathens of all sorts. There are also people that call themselves Druids. So Druidism is quite strong in the UK as well. So if, for example, if you have the solstices and the equinoxes, they will gather in stone circles, like, for example, Stonehenge, and then do the ceremonic of the Celtic year. But for example, what my wife is involved in is the goddess community. So there's also a strong community of people that believe in a deity that is feminine. So.
Yeah, again, a very interesting discourse. I've followed a number of documentaries which talk about, they refer to it as the sacred feminine. I think this is perhaps the Christian take, but also before the sort of monotheism of the Christian church. A lot of other beliefs included female deities. I mean, Sophia, I think, Sophism is one such. So I mean, there are many different cultures which do have a divine feminine, if not more than a divine feminine. So it does make sense.
Yeah, I've seen a documentary the other day about the Christian God and his evolution, so to say, and what his origins are. And apparently he had a partner as well. So he had a wife or female partner. But by time, kind of the monotheism in Christianity gained the upper hand. And So, I mean, there are a couple of approaches when it comes to integrating the feminine into spirituality and belief. So there are those who are saying it's the feminine and the masculine have their parts to play in spirituality, whereas others more do the monotheistic approach, but with a female deity in its center.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely a learning process with me as well. I tend to approach things in a more inclusive fashion, and I kind of steer away from absolutism, because I feel that in the past, when I have been so certain about something, dealing with the realization that that certainty was misplaced was more of a challenge to me than the process of learning. So it's much easier, I think, to accept new information and to consider new perspectives when you are, or I am at least, not so fixated on a specific policy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in the strictest sense, when you have the scientific approach, basically what we see as facts is just the current hypothesis that hasn't been proven wrong yet.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, as in the scientific approach, as you say, it is the best argument which covers most of the facts that are represented by the situation. And then when more information comes in, then you can revisit it. But yeah, not everybody's in a position to revisit. And obviously scientific progress sometimes takes time as well.
Yes, definitely. That is something I learned during my studies at university, that even in a field of science like physics, there are professors that have a certain approach, and they have their kind of belief system into how to interpret certain finds. And even if the basis of experiments and results has changed in a way that hypothesis that professor is still clinging on to has been proven wrong, it will take probably one generation of researchers to kind of embrace that new approach, just out of respect for that professor who was their mentor at that time.
Yeah, as you say, even in learned circles, change comes slowly. It's sometimes very difficult to accept and embrace change. But it's also interesting. I'm sure for you identify differences in approaches, and again, sort of bringing in the sort of social and cultural differences. So, I mean, for example, just the differences between the English and German languages. German seems far more fact-based. It seems like a more mathematical, more scientific language, whereas English is a bit more descriptive. It seeks to explain rather than identify and observe. Would you? Is this something that you perhaps would also have noticed, or am I just chatting crap here?
I'm not sure whether it's inherent to the language, but it's most certainly inherent to the approaches in science. So I have a master's degree in archaeology, and I've had the majority of my studies were in Germany, but I've also kind of peeked into the English approach to archaeology, and it's quite funny because in German archaeology it's very much fact driven. So if you have a archaeological talk by a German archaeologist, he would say that is our site, or this is our find, and we have parallels here, and we have that and that hypothesis, and then we raise statistics and do spatial analysis, etc., etc. So it's very much fact-driven, whereas a lot of talks by archaeologists in England start by "Let me tell you a story." So it's much more
descriptive then in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of telling a tale, as it were, as opposed to this is more social, cultural than factual and scientific.
Yeah, I would say it's that. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, also the British archaeology is using statistics and spatial analysis, and
Yeah, but I mean, just to give a very simple example, it's one that I tend to go to because everybody can sort of appreciate it. If a native English speaker sees somebody walking down the street, then they will use the progressive form and say she is walking, whereas the German is sie läuft, as in that is the simple form. There is no progressive form in German, strictly speaking, grammatically, from my understanding. So, I mean, again, it's very much geared towards stating a fact. So the English is to make an observation and to talk about what is developing, describing a situation, and the German is explaining that is it. Yeah, and I do find these two approaches to be, very interesting because it's very possible that you could have two scientists with completely different approaches. They would, in some cases, they may come to the same conclusion, but obviously the presentations would be markedly different. But in other situations, you're going to have a different result, and it's just fascinating the way that this can happen. One of your specialist points of interest is castles, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So my master's thesis was about a mod type castle in the Rhine Valley. So it was first construction was at the beginning of the 10th century, and then there were three phases of that castle being reconstructed over the course of time. And what I did was, or what I was able to do was to analyze the wooden structures in that castle, or forming that castle, because there were at least two incidents where the castle was destroyed, and then they would use the debris to kind of heighten the mount of that mod. And since it was in a waterlogged condition, all of the woods were preserved over the course of time, and then to kind of get some fixed dates for the different stages of construction, we could use dendrochronology, which was quite helpful to get actual fixed dates for when the trees were cut down to build the structures.
And despite the fact that in those times, I guess they didn't really have the flow of information was markedly different to what it is today. I mean, can you observe similarities between the construction of castles from different areas? So, like your typical sort of German 10th century castle and your typical English 10th century castle. I mean, were there similarities, or were they largely different constructions?
Well, there are certainly similarities and differences, but they are springing from different sources. So within the different regions, you have different approaches, simply based on what kind of source material you have to construct the castle, and also what the topography is that you're located in. So whether you're down in the valley, where you kind of can use the water to your advantage, whereas if you're up on a hilltop, you then use the kind of the height difference to your advantage, and then also what kind of materials are available. If you have stone available, or if you're using wood to construct the fortifications. So there are kind of differences in castle constructions in the region itself, but when it comes to the more wider focus, when you're comparing different regions to each other, I don't really think that the flow of information was more inhibited than it is today, because people were highly mobile and they were pretty much aware of their surroundings. And especially when it comes to castle construction, or construction in general, when you have the stonemasons, there was quite a high mobility moving around Europe. But of course, there are certain differences in style, which is go on.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. So, I mean, with the choice of wood or stone, I guess this is a financial decision. So, if somebody has more money, then they would go for stone, or was it simply a question of development initially?
Bit of both. So after the decline of the Roman Empire, we also have a kind of decline in technology. Although you could also state that's also based on if there's demand for certain fortification structures, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have smaller entities of power. So you have small local warlords, you could say, having governance over a smaller territory. So there's really no need for massive fortifications to control a larger area. So that's why you probably don't have huge stone fortifications in that time, and that will kind of continue through the Middle Ages. That approach, for example, the castle I was working on in my master's thesis was of a ministerialen, as you say in German, or I don't know what the Latin term is, but basically it's a knight serving a larger lord, and depending on how successful they were in their service, those knights, they would acquire quite substantial wealth, and so they were able to develop their home into a castle. And it's pretty much depending on what financial resources you have, and also there are legal implications. So not everybody is allowed to build a stone fortification, and there are.
Yeah, if you're like my lord, and I'm your knight, and I'm there sort of collecting taxes from in a specific region, and then all of a sudden you come to visit me, and I've built a stone castle, and you've got a wooden one. I guess you're going to consider me a thief, because there's no way I should have had that much money that I can build a stone castle, but also a bit of a threat, because I'm a formidable knight now with a very defensible position.
Yeah, that's right. And there are, especially in the 11th to 12th century, when we have the rise of that kind of middle class of knights, when they come into wealth and trying to find their increased status in society, there's quite a lot of conflict between those those knights rising through the ranks, and the settled-in nobility, because of course that's a problem when you have somebody who has inherited a certain status in society, but due to bad planning or luck or whatever, he has lost the or warfare has lost the financial ability to kind of display that status. Whereas if you have somebody who doesn't have the heritage background, but simply has the economic capacity to build such a massive fortification, then then there's conflict in the air, so to say. And there were a lot of kind of military conflicts, but also legal conflicts between those opposing parties trying to settle those disputes. So there are a lot of sources where knights were ordered to pull down their fortifications because they kind of overstepped as to how big and how massive they were building.
Okay, were some of these knights Templars? Because the Templars kind of did grow in power, didn't they, between the time frames that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, not really, because the Templars themselves were monks, you could say. So they didn't possess any goods themselves. So that was all castles and all lands were possessed by the order themselves. So
yeah. Okay, not as individuals, but as the group of Templars that they were.
Yes.
So, okay.
Yeah,
all right.
That's right.
So, all right. So slightly different. Okay. And then the other question I was going to ask was about the general sort of technological development and the distribution of knowledge, as it were, or information. Was this largely also contributed to by the Masonic orders? So the ability to build was a kind of skill that was protected, wasn't it? So that they could in some way control the quality or the influence of their own membership?
I have never really looked into the Masonic order, so I don't know if that's the fact or not. I mean, what's strongly interwoven in medieval architecture is churches or cathedrals and castles. So because you have the same workers working on those projects.
All right. I mean, there are in quite a few churches as well evidence of Masonic art, Masonic figurines, and so on. And these are simply, I guess nowadays you'd consider it like an Easter egg if we're talking about software. But it's just something left behind as a kind of a significant message, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, if you have big building projects like a cathedral or a castle, the stonemasons would basically spend their whole career working on that one project. And I think there's just I don't know if there's a more spiritual meaning behind that. Probably is in terms of working traditions, etc. But maybe it's just the longing to kind of leave something behind that is something individual to yourself, rather than just kind of fulfilling the request of the person that provided the finance to build that that castle or that cathedral.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because you make reference to the affluence, I suppose, successful merchants as opposed to landed gentry and the aristocracy and so on. Essentially, what you're describing is a class conflict,
Yes.
and this is something which we're familiar with today. It has
Yes.
not been eradicated. It's perhaps been expanded today. We don't fight battles, as it were, but there is the conflict is still there.
Mm.
How prevalent was it then in those times? As in, do you think that because people simply accepted the fact that they were born peasants and they will die peasants, there was no point getting involved? Do you think now, because education has been extended to so many people, that we know we can do better? I mean, is that a fair observation to make?
Mm, I mean, especially in the Middle Ages, basically everybody was a Christian and was a believer and went to church, and what the church mainly preached was that the situation or the hierarchy in the social classes is something that's given by God, and therefore only a few people would challenge that order because you didn't want to defy God.
Okay, all right. So essentially, control exercised through religious dogma.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and the influence of the church, clearly.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. I also remember listening to a podcast which talked about the development of the church in certain areas, and apparently one of the reasons why the church was able to establish a foothold in Scandinavian countries was because it was actually the Irish church which moved there. And from what I was told, that there was a huge, it was a fusion of paganism and the church in Ireland, and so therefore the Irish church still maintained a lot of the older traditions of the Celtic order, and the Celtic culture, and as a
Mm.
result of that, these things were also recognizable in Scandinavian cultures, and so therefore they were actually Christianized through the Irish church as opposed to through other churches.
Yeah, although I'm not 100% familiar with how Christianity was brought to Scandinavia, but what I know is that especially in the for 5th to 8th century, the Irish church was very productive in going into non-Christian lands and bringing Christianity there. So that wasn't only something that's true for Scandinavia, but also for Germany and even more eastern parts of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So especially in Germany, I think one of the advisors of Charlemagne was also an Irish monk.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Need to look up who it was exactly. But yeah, when it came to the expansion of the kingdom of Charlemagne, the Irish monks played a huge part in bringing Christianity to Saxony and Frisia, etc.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned France. Okay, it wasn't called France in those days, perhaps, but well, what I also I've always found it interesting. There is a part of Bavaria, the northern part of Bavaria. It's called Franken, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And obviously France is called France, and there's a similarity in the name.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wondered how that was possible. But then I listened to a history professor say that essentially there was a move from Francia
Mm-hmm.
to modern day France. And that is exactly where they got the name. So essentially today's France is based on people from originally that German area.
Yeah, I always find that fascinating how long those naming conventions or names find their way through history. So sometimes it's 2,000 years, 4,000 years, or even more that those names kind of prevail. And yeah, if you don't actually find an interest in that and start looking for the causes, you're just taking that for granted, and you never wonder about that till at some point you do your research.
Yeah, I mean, I can't claim to have been particularly educated along certain lines. I won't say that I've researched all of these different sort of cultures and periods in history, but what I have done is I've got a half decent memory, so I tend to be able to recollect certain things, and I also try to make combinations, and I find that I make sense by identifying similar terms, similar terminologies, because there's no way in my mind that two completely different languages, for example, would use the same word without there being some form of a relationship between them. And then I sort of go into it and I do a bit of research and I find it out. And so for me, I think I'm quite lucky because I've learned Italian and I'm learning German. And obviously I speak English, and so therefore that's quite a wealth of sort of linguistic development there for me to draw connections between, and it's fascinating to be able to do that sometimes.
Yeah, and especially when you come to Italy, there's also of course you have the Etruscan heritage. So that's kind of what the Italian part of the language is based on. But then in northern Italy, you have the Lombards who moved into that region as so the Lombards being a Germanic tribe who moved there in the during the migration period. And so there's when you come to northern Italy, there's also strong Germanic influence there.
Well, yeah, I mean, literally, but also by name. So I think Milan or Milano is in Lombardia. So therefore, obviously, the name has remained, connected and true to its history.
Yep.
But also, as you say, to the north. So in Italy, I think they call it Alto Adige, but Südtirol, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, a lot of parts of those areas, and also towards sort of Friuli, there is quite a Germanic influence in the way things are done. So, yeah. I mean, the study of Europe in itself, it's so fascinating, and I think we forget it to our peril. The sheer level of interconnectedness that all of these cultures have, it's unbelievable. And when you go even further east, and I'm terribly ignorant, so I'm not going to ask too many questions about it, but as in when you go further east, those connections become more complex, but at the same time also extremely rich in historical value. Yeah.
I've seen a exhibition about the wreckage of Uluburun. Must have been 25 years ago now. I don't know if you're aware of that. If you're not, you definitely should look it up. So the Uluburun was a merchant vessel that sank on the south coast of modern day Turkey, and I think it went down at let's be 2,300 BC, or somewhere between 2,300 and 1,800 BC, and they had quite a lot of goods on the vessel when it sank. And then what really blew my mind was they had a map there, and they had the center point was the wreck, and then they had kind of a line drawn to each part from where the goods that were on that wreck came from in Europe, and was just a ginormous web spanning from Wales, where the tin came from, that was on that wreck, down to Egypt, because there were some golden scarabs from Egypt that I think had the seal of Nefertiti. So Nefertiti.
Nefertiti, yeah.
Yeah, and then they had what's ambers from the Eastern Sea.
Okay.
What's
The
Ostsee?
Baltic
Sea, exactly. Yeah. So there
Wow.
was a huge network of trade already going on in the Bronze Age, and yeah, so there was a lot of exchange of goods, and of course also exchange of ideas in even that 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And if you go further back, apparently there was trade with certain kind of stone even during the Stone Ages, because there were some deposits of stone that were quite valued because they were quite good to make tools from in certain regions. So they would trade not only the finished blades, but also half products. So then in some other regions of Europe, they could kind of build the blades from the flint that were part of their culture or their way of living, so to say.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, simply adding lots of fuel to the fire in my belly with regards to the theory of interconnectedness, and in fact, the further back we look, the closer we see our sort of collective cultures becoming. Yeah, it's brilliant, and so I mean, you know, I love the fact that you did so much by way of studies into history. And there are many topics that we kind of wanted to talk about, but we're not going to get to be able to do so because we've already pushed towards an hour. But I also want to flip back a little bit because you've got a master's in archaeology. You clearly love archaeology, and we will talk in more detail, I hope, in another few podcasts about the fact that you also build shields and you make your own bows and arrows. So you are completely fascinated in the way of life of a medieval period. But you're actually a techie. You're a very technical person.
Yeah.
And obviously your knowledge of technology is way above my head. But can you just for the purposes of my understanding, there's quite a close relationship, isn't there, between your studies in archaeology and the work that you have to do in a technical capacity on a daily basis?
Well, to be fair, you could say I'm interested in technology.
Yeah.
So being it medieval technology or even prehistoric technology, or being it the technology we are using on a day-to-day basis. But if you're studying archaeology in these days, it's a highly technical science because we're using a lot of computers and spatial analysis and airborne laser scanning and all kinds of scientific approaches to history. So it's not all shirts and digging in the ground with spades. That's part of it as well. But a lot of research happens actually on the computer, and therefore you need at least some degree of affinity to technology to be able to work in that field.
Yeah. It's I still find it fascinating, and it's also great that you can combine disciplines trained in completely different subjects, and yet still make them work for you in a professional capacity. And and as we kind of alluded to at the beginning, the transition from Germany to the UK at a time of such social and political change, and then in the same process, I mean, you've always, as you said, had a passion for technology. To then also pursue this completely different line, it just shows in many ways the power of positive thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, what also plays a huge part in it is if you're in a strong relationship with a partner, which I am in my marriage, because what we always say is whatever life throws at us, we're gonna make it work, and we'll figure something out, and that has worked so far. So
Wonderful. Long may it continue.
yes,
Yeah, brilliant. What can I say? It's been a tough road, being getting to find an opportunity for us to talk. I hope the next one will be easier to organise,
yeah,
now that we've opened the door to dialogue. Um, but yeah, from me, thank you very much. My compliments to the family as well, around this festive period. And I wish you guys a wonderful, you say in German, as a guten Rutsch, a wonderful slide into
yeah,
2022.
exactly.
Yeah, enjoy.
And the same to you.
Two and a mic. Two and a mic. Two, 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 two.